Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Sam Hurst and I am, long title here, the Alan Price Memorial Postdoctoral Teaching Fellow at the University of Liverpool. If you are live tweeting this or you wish just to contact me about the talk or any questions you have about the Gothic, you can find me on Twitter at romgothsam. You can also contact me by email, so it's quite a simple email address, s.hurst2@liverpool.ac.uk. So if you have any questions arising from this talk, you want me to put together a bibliography for you or some reading suggestions in the early Gothic, or you have any questions, feel free to get in touch using that email. So the talk today is Behind the Black Veil, and I've chosen this title for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of Catherine's interest and almost obsession with the mystery of the Black Veil in Northanger Abbey. So it's the most obvious and concrete example of the Gothic as a specific reference in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. The second reason I've chosen it is because this mystery of the Black Veil points us back to one of the most famous authors and one of the most famous works of the early British Gothic in the 1790s, The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. And it also points us back to one of the most famous of those early Gothic mysteries. What is behind the Black Veil? What I'm not going to be doing today is going through in detail close reading of the text and looking at all the instances of the uses of Gothic tropes or techniques. Rather, I'm going to be looking at the horrid mysteries inspiring Northanger Abbey. So you might notice this phrasing here, horrid mysteries. I've deliberately not used the Gothic for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that Austen herself uses the term horrid to describe those Gothic novels that she's talking about, the horrid novels, quite famously. The second is that the term Gothic comes with a lot of baggage and expectations. Now, in sort of popular understandings and popular culture, that might be, so for example, tied to Gothic subcultures or Gothic aesthetics, often tied to ideas of the 19th century Gothic and key texts like Dracula by Bram Stoker, Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. It's also linked, if you're into sort of Gothic criticism and Gothic study, in this early period of the Gothic, which is from 1764 to about 1820 or 1830, it's linked to particular conceptions of the Gothic which were retrospectively created, i.e. the sort of way that we've streamlined our understanding of the Gothic and put it into neat little boxes. But what happens when we look at Northanger Abbey and we look at the different Gothic texts that are referenced is that those boxes start to come a little bit unstuck, and it can challenge our preconceptions of what the Gothic is. Now, before I start to talk about the specific influences on Northanger Abbey, I want to quickly think about the relationship between Northanger Abbey as a novel and the Gothic. So we often think of it as a Gothic parody, and it is a parody in to some extent. So it's obviously the story of Catherine Morland, who is an avid reader of Gothic novels, and they completely influence her view of the world. She uses these Gothic novels not only to entertain herself, but also to inform her interpretation and interaction with the world. And this leads to often a number of misunderstandings and sometimes fairly comic results, at other times less comic. So often when we think about the interactions with the Gothic, we think about these various sort of mysteries that Catherine makes up in her own mind, in a sense, that then have a pathetic reveal. So we have, for example, when she's staying at Northanger Abbey and she's intrigued by the history and what happened to Tilney's mother. She's looking through the bedroom, she's looking through the trunks and the cupboards and the cases, and she finds a sheaf of papers. What could it be? The candle goes out, there's some mystery, there's some creepiness going on. And she uses her sort of Gothic reading to interpret what might be happening. So she's thinking about texts like The Romance of the Forest, where the heroine Adeline is staying in an abandoned abbey, and she ends up finding a trunk containing papers which tell the mystery of her father's murder. So Catherine's expecting something similar, but of course, what she actually finds is a laundry list. So we have these kind of comic moments. We also have throughout the book the way in which Catherine interprets the world through this Gothic lens, this Gothic framing. So the most obvious example of this is how she sort of interacts with Northanger Abbey itself. and her understanding and readings of General Tilney, and this idea that, well, maybe he's murdered his wife or she's locked away. So she's referencing or thinking of texts like, again, Anne Radcliffe's Sicilian Romance, where the mother is locked in a cellar for 10 years, or texts like Orphan of the Rhine or Mysterious Warning, where you have various murders going on. Of course, the reality is somewhat more mundane. We also see the influence of her Gothic lens more broadly within the book in how she interacts and interprets her relationships with other people. This is something that's less often mentioned in considering those ties between the Gothic and Northanger Abbey. So, for example, we can take her relationship with Isabella Thorpe, where she is slow to discover Isabella's real character. Later in the novel, Catherine talks about the ways in which, in Gothic novels, characters are black and white, good or bad, hero or villain. They're extremes, but in real life we have mixed characters. But this is something that she has to learn through the course of the book. Her Gothic lens has led her to expect these extremes and made it incredibly difficult for her to interpret sort of persuasive people like Isabella, or people who are mixed characters containing both good and bad, who can both betray you and have great conversations with books about you, books with you, sorry. This idea of the Gothic lens has really been lent into by the productions, or by the television and film productions of Northanger Abbey. And I've used a couple of examples here just to draw this out and make a couple of points. So this is from the 2007 ITV version. And as in the BBC version, we have Catherine's daydreams, where she has these kind of Gothic fantasies going on in her head. As with Jane Austen's novel, there are general references to Gothic tropes and specific references to particular novels. So we might see at the bottom, for example, there's this reference to highwaymen, sort of a common trope in the early Gothic, this idea of the banditti and the condottieri who are waiting to kidnap or hurt you by the side of the road. We've got the idea of midnight rescues and sort of heroes rescuing you from entrapment. I think it's a general reference, but I've always read this particular incident in the film as a reference back to Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe, where Adeline keeps getting midnight rescued. We also have specific references. So the reference to the top corner where Catherine's in the bath is actually a reference to the Monk by Matthew Lewis, which is a reference that Jane Austen makes as well, and we'll come back to that. In the Monk, Montoni has a magic myrtle that allows him to walk through walls. And in this scene from the film, we see Tilney walking through the wall while she's in the bath and then being like, hello. So we've got all of these elements of Gothic parody going in, but Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey and Jane Austen herself is doing more than mock the Gothic. Northanger Abbey is also a Gothic novel, and Catherine's Gothic lens might mislead her, but it also allows her to see some of the underlying reality, some of the underlying darknesses of the world that she lives in behind the polite society veneer. So often we stop with Tilney. What do I mean by this? Well, when Tilney discovers Catherine's kind of fevered imaginings about what his father has done, when he discovers her sort of looking illicitly at his mother's room or painting, he asks her, "Dear Miss Morland, consider the dreadful nature of the suspicions you have entertained. What have you been judging from? Remember the country and the age in which we live. Remember that we are English, that we are Christians. Consult your own understanding, your own sense of the probable, your own observation of what is passing around you. Does our education prepare us for such atrocities? Do our laws connive at them? Could they be perpetrated without being known in a country like this, where social and literary intercourse is on such a footing, where every man is surrounded by a neighbourhood of voluntary spies, and where roads and newspapers lay everything open? Dearest Miss Morland, what ideas have you been admitting?" So often when we're talking about Northanger Abbey, we talk as though Jane Austen agreed with Henry Tilney, as though we agree with Henry Tilney, that we're mocking or judging Catherine for her use of this Gothic lens. However, by the end of the book, we get a slightly different interpretation from Catherine. So when she's first rebuked by Tilney, she's covered with shame, starts to blame her reading. But later on, we find when she works out the actual history of General Tilney, or is told about his history and his sort of current reasons for ejecting her from the house, he thinks Catherine at any rate heard enough to feel that in suspecting General Tilney of either murdering or shutting up his wife, she had scarcely sinned against his character or magnified his cruelty. In other words, her Gothic lens has allowed her to see an underlying reality. She's misinterpreted how it works. She's thought of dungeons and murder rather than neglect or abuse or indifference or marriages for money, or the sort of cold logic of a man only out for himself and social position. But she has seen the underlying darkness, and the Gothic lens has allowed that. Because after all, this is a world where General Tilney might not be murdering his wife, but he was responsible in some part for her suffering and her death. It's suggested in the text. It's also a world where you might not be kidnapped by banditti or by highwaymen or by robbers, but you might just be carried away in a chase by a gentleman to Blaise Castle who won't listen to what you want and tricks you into it, ignoring your will and your agency. So there is a Gothic reality underlying Catherine's sort of the more civil veneer of Catherine's reality. And the Gothic allows her to start to see this and to start to engage with it. So the Gothic is for more than entertainment, it's being suggested, I would argue. And we find another use for the Gothic because it tells us a lot about the characters who read it. So reading the Gothic isn't rejected by the text at all. Henry Tilney is a big Gothic fan. He's read all of Mrs. Radcliffe's works, for example, and quite forcefully says, the person, be it gentleman or lady, who has not pleasure in a good novel must be intolerably stupid. I have read all Mrs. Radcliffe's works, and most of them with great pleasure. Mysteries of Udolpho, when I had once begun it, I could not lay down again. I remembered finishing it in 2 days, my hair standing on end the whole time. So in other words, he's not simply reading Gothic novels, he's engaging with them at an emotional level. He's having this kind of thrilling emotional experience of reading them, this pleasure in the frisson of terror and horror that Catherine is experiencing. But something is a little bit notable here. It's about his taste in the Gothic and the type of Gothic that he likes. In mentioning Mrs. Radcliffe, he's not only mentioning one of the most popular writers of the 1790s, but he's also mentioning one of the most praised and respected/respectable of the Gothic writers of the period. He's also gesturing towards a taste in what I would call the Terra Gothic. And I'm going to come back to this idea later, that there were two sort of key strands of the Gothic in the 1790s, in that early period. Now, I don't want to universalize and say that there were only two, but we're going to differentiate between broad categories of the Terra Gothic and the Horror Gothic. And Tilney is interested in the Terra Gothic. On the other hand, John Thorpe shows his bad taste in the Gothic, and his taste in literature tells us a lot about him. So he also suggests that maybe he's read Mrs. Radcliffe's novels, but he doesn't originally recognize the name of The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is by far Radcliffe's most famous novel, even in the period. It was very famous, very, very popular, bestseller. He says that he's read her, but it's more about fashion, I would argue, than about his own tastes. But what he does admit to liking, what he says is a tolerably decent novel, Tom Jones and the Monk. And at first sight, those might appear to be quite different novels. You've got a mid-century picaresque, and you've got a late 18th century, from 1796, scandalous novel of a demonic monk and his fall, which was roundly sort of critiqued as blasphemous and salacious in its time. But what is it that these books have in common? Well, it's exactly that last thing that I mentioned. They're both quite salacious for the period, for the standards of respectable literature of the period, or mainstream publishing. So his taste gives us quite an insight into his character. Ooh, there's the groceries. I'll be back in just a second. Oh, no. There we go. So we've got this idea of the split. between Terra and Horror Gothic, and John Thorpe's bad taste in the Gothic. So I've been mentioning the 1790s as the key period of the Gothic, which we find in Northanger Abbey, referenced in Northanger Abbey. And I'm going to get into the 1790s in a moment. But in order to sort of understand the 1790s Gothic and the real heyday of the Gothic, I'm just going to take us back a little bit, take us back to the prehistory of the Northanger Gothic and the rise of the Gothic novel. So, as you're probably aware, the first Gothic novel, or the novel that's often considered to be the first Gothic novel, was, Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. It was published in 1764 originally, and it was published, as you see here, in the second edition as a Gothic story. It was originally published as a translation rather than a novel, but after its positive reception, he admitted to having written it, which got less of a positive response. But The Castle of Otranto sort of gives us many of the key features of the early Gothic. It's a medieval setting. It's a tale of usurpation, a hero in disguise, of judgment upon the sins of the father. It's also got various examples of the supernatural, from walking paintings to skeletal monks to giant swords to falling helmets. But what Walpole also does in his preface to the second edition, when he's admitting he wrote it, is give us a sort of an idea of what he was intending to do with the genre and what the Gothic genre is about. So the Gothic genre was an attempt to blend two kinds of romance. And by romance here, he's meaning fictional writing, the ancient and the modern. In the former, always imagination and probability. In the latter, nature is always intended to be copied with success. So what are these two forms that he's trying to blend? Well, he's trying to blend the ancient romance, so the chivalric, the medieval romance, things like the tales of Arthur and his court, and the modern romance, or the modern novel. And he's trying to take from the former those ideas of imagination, the improbable, the supernatural, but moving away from those ideas of character archetypes and a lack of reality. He's wanting to mix it in with more realistic portrayals of people. And you can debate whether he was successful or not. But this is the intent of the Gothic, to combine these two things in a new form of writing. Now, before we get to the 1790s, the Gothic takes off relatively slowly. And I'm going to take us through some sort of key steps in its development here. The next Gothic story, which again named itself the Gothic story, was Clara Reeve's The Old English Baron, which was published in 1778. It was originally part published under a different title, The Champion of Virtue, a slightly different version, privately published or privately circulated as in 1777, but it's the English Baron that we're interested in, this sort of official publication. And Clara Reeve is directly interacting with the Castle of Otranto and trying to make it better, essentially, to correct the excesses of Walpole, because she said he made everything so supernatural. It was ridiculous. It was too much. It took us away from probability. So she tries to draw us back in. So it's again a tale set in the medieval period. It's a tale of usurpation, of a hidden hero, and it has the supernatural, but this supernatural is much more subdued. You see in the illustration there, the key example of the supernatural in the novel, which is the visitation of the hero's father to reveal some of the details of his own death and murder. So this is a real turning point in the Gothic towards what we're going to be seeing in the 1790s in writers like Radcliffe and the Terra Gothic, this stepping away from an emphasis on the supernatural to make it all a bit more probable. Then the Recess or Tale of Other Times is advertised as a historical romance, but it's often counted as being part of this progression or development of the Gothic novel. Not all Gothic stories were labeling themselves Gothic stories. The Recess is by Sophia Lee, and it tells a tale of alternate history, essentially. It reimagines history, a slightly later period, and imagines what would have happened if Mary, Queen of Scots, had daughters. And these daughters are raised in the Recess, a kind of labyrinthine structure underneath a country house, where monks had originally sort of fled after the Reformation. After they leave the Recess, they end up having various kind of adventures, trials, and vicissitudes all over the world. Doesn't end happily for anybody. spoiler alert. But we also see here this interest in sort of other periods of history, and we also see this turn to the female protagonist. I've popped the last one in not because it's a particularly influential novel, but because its writer was. So The Castles of Athlin and Dunbayne is a short Gothic novel, just a single volume, and it is the first of Anne Radcliffe's works, published in 1789, also, interestingly, the same year as the fall of the Bastille, which I will go back to as a slightly suggestive thing. But The Castles of Athlin and Dunbayne is an early work. It's not very similar to her later works, but we're beginning to see some of the tropes that would become characteristic of Radcliffe and characteristic of the early Gothic in its heyday. But this, like The Old English Baron and like The Castle of Otranto, is a tale of usurpation and a hero in disguise with predominantly male characters. But here we're getting, in these volumes, we're seeing something in English Baron, in Castles of Athlin and Dunbayne and The Recess, we're seeing something that contradicts some of our expectations of the early Gothic, and it's worth noting it. We're often told that the early Gothic was all set overseas, in France or Italy or Spain, but that's not quite true. Many of these texts either took place in an English past, not the majority, but many, or in this sort of idea of these wild locales in England. So the North, for example, or places in Britain, such as Scotland or Wales, or even not in Britain, in Ireland. These are all places that become kind of wilded in the Gothic. And that's something to bear in mind, and it will come back in a quotation from Jane Austen later. But let's move to the 1790s now and investigate those two different kind of key strands of the Gothic. So I like to differentiate and call them the Terra Gothic and the Horror Gothic. You might have heard of them as the female and the male Gothic, but I don't like the terms because I think they're quite misleading for a couple of reasons. If we call this the female Gothic, we have the expectation that it's written by women, whereas it was written by both women and men. And it also sort of sets some barriers and parameters around what women were writing, which is very kind of limiting on what women were actually doing and writing in the Gothic. So the distinction that I'm making between Terra and Horror Gothic is based on a distinction that Radcliffe herself made between terror and horror. So for Radcliffe, terror is something that raises your curiosity. It forces your mind into exploration, wonder, fear. So for example, it's a sound at night that has you sitting up in bed, straining your senses, trying to imagine what it could possibly be. The Mysteries of Udolpho is a key example of the Terra Gothic, so it's useful for picking out some of the key features of what was going on in these narratives. Now, often these narratives focused around a virtuous heroine and a sentimental hero, or a weeble hero, as I like to call them. So somebody who is a sort of male hero who is showing or engaged in these practices of sort of sensibility and sentiment and sentimentality, but isn't actually very useful in almost any of these stories. Now, not all of the Terra Gothic, as we'll see, has this dynamic, and we'll think about that again in the horrid novels, but this is the sort of most common trope. We have them journeying through sublime landscapes, often in Europe or in these kind of wild places of the UK and Ireland. There's often ruined castles, ruined abbeys, ruined manor houses, often crammed full of secrets. We have heroines that end up traveling, and you'll know that Catherine is very eager to travel herself. These traveling heroines, although in the Gothic, of course, their travel is often not by choice. They're sometimes kidnapped, they're sometimes forced to go to different places, to flee to different places. There's also this idea of hidden passageways and tunnels is really central to a lot of these novels, through which the heroines will flee or where they will hide. Religious institutions form a key part, sometimes corrupt and threatening, sometimes places of sanctuary or comfort. We also have, we see in the Terra Gothic, increasingly attractive villains. And I don't mean attractive physically, although possibly, but attractive in terms of being quite magnetic. And we see this growing as a trend within the early British Gothic. We also have the idea of the superstitious servant who will believe anything, is always falling into ghost belief, terrified. There's a little bit of overlap, I would argue, with the Gothic servant in Catherine at times. The Terra Gothic also has a happy ending. So these are novels that end usually in companionate marriage. Everybody gets paired off. Everything is all right. And this is the type of Gothic with which Jane Austen is chiefly interested. This is the one which Henry Tilney enjoys and which Catherine is reading a great deal of. This is the one which is shown to definitely have value in Jane Austen's world. So one of the most famous writers of the Terra Gothic was Anne Radcliffe, and you'll know about the Mysteries of Udolpho, but this is her sort of publishing history here. She wasn't particularly prolific, and she mysteriously stopped publishing in 1796. And she didn't then publish again until, well, she never published again. Her remaining works were published posthumously by her husband and a man called Thomas Noon Talfourd, who put together a memoir of the author with extracts from her journals, and then included Gaston de Blondeville, a very supernatural tale set in the medieval period, St. Albans Abbey, a long narrative poem, and other selected poetry. So the books that were published while she was alive included Castles of Athen and Dunbayne, which I've already mentioned, a Sicilian romance from 1790, the Romance of the Forest from 1791, Mysteries of Udolpho, of course, the Italian from 1796, and not a novel, but a series of travel journals or some travel writing, her journey through Holland and the Low Countries from 1795. The texts that are specifically mentioned, though, in Northanger Abbey are the main text that's mentioned is the Mysteries of Udolpho, which Catherine is reading with great delight. And we have this conversation between her and Isabella. So Isabella asks, have you gone on with Udolpho? To which Catherine replies, yes, I've been reading it ever since I woke. I've got to the Black Veil. Are you indeed? How delightful. Oh, I would not tell you what is behind the Black Veil for the world. Are not you wild to know? Oh, yes, quite. What can it be? But do not tell me. I would not be told upon any account. I know it must be a skeleton. I'm sure it is Laurentina's skeleton. Oh, I am delighted with the book. I should like to spend my whole life in reading it. I assure you, if it had not been to meet you, I would not have come away from it for all the world. So what is this Black Veil that Catherine is so interested in and excited by? Well, one of the techniques for which Anne Radcliffe is most famous, and it's not universal in her work, but it is certainly common, is the supernatural explained. We have seemingly supernatural incidents which are resolved as being natural in origin. So, for example, in the Mysteries of Udolpho, there is some music that plays, and the local peasantry tells Emily that this is the music that sounds before somebody's death. And lo and behold, her father dies. However, we learn much, much later, several hundred pages later, that this is not magical music. It's just a mad nun, of course, wandering around the forest playing her guitar because of her guilty conscience. Just go with it, guys. Just pretend it makes sense. But this idea of the supernatural explained is this idea of the possibly supernatural resolved as natural, but also in Radcliffe, it's particularly associated with these long pauses, these long drawn out gaps between the presentation of the mystery and its resolution. In her early works like Sicilian Romance and Romance of the Forest, the resolution usually comes a lot quicker. But as she got more and more prolix, particularly the Mysteries of Udolpho, those gaps become wider and wider and wider. Now, the Black Veil isn't an example of the supernatural explained because there's no supernatural involved, no supernatural explanation is suggested, but it is the same technique. So we're presented with a mystery. Emily is wandering around the castle of Udolpho. There's some mystery about the fate of the former owner of the castle, Laurentini. And she's learned that there's something behind the Black Veil. So she goes, she pulls it back, and we're told that she fainted. It was so horrifying. But then we're not told what it is until right at the end of the novel. So that's what this reference is to. But something that I think is quite interesting is that if you know your Gothic, this little conversation with Isabella is quite revealing about Isabella's personality. So the Mystery of the Black Veil was one of the most famous mysteries of the early Gothic, but it was also one of the most famous disappointments. So one of the things that Radcliffe was often critiqued for was in raising expectations and creating these tensions and terrors that were then sort of undone by these mundane resolutions, these mundane understandings. And this critique was particularly applied to the Black Veil for a number of reasons, I think. The answer to the mystery is produced really inorganically in the text. There's no way that she would have known it. There's no kind of mechanics through which it's told to her. There's no servant that reveals the secret, or she doesn't stumble upon it. It just appears in the text. We're told what it is right at the end of the novel. And second, it really is quite a disappointing reveal. I'm going to tell you what it is now. So if you want to avoid spoilers, turn off your sound until we get to the next slide. The reveal is that it's not Laurentini's skeleton. It's got nothing to do with the current mysteries of Udolpho. Rather, it is a wax statue, a memento mori, that belonged to somebody from a couple of generations ago. So it's really not doing anything connected to the plot whatsoever. But what's quite interesting, I think, about noticing this technique of the supernatural explained, or this prolongation of the mystery, is that that's the exact technique that we find in Northanger Abbey. So the thing that we associate with being a parody of the Gothic is actually a technique of the Gothic as well. So the supernatural explained in novels like The Mysteries of Udolpho is often used to show how the heroine lets her imagination run away with her, and to caution both the heroine and the reader not to do that, not to let your mind sort of run along superstitious lines and just come up with wilder and wilder scenarios. So in using this same technique, Jane Austen isn't simply parodying the Gothic, she's also reproducing it. Now, the second novel by Anne Radcliffe that is actually mentioned in Northanger Abbey is The Italian, which was her last novel published before her death. And it's quite different to The Mysteries of Udolpho in some ways. There's a lot of similarities of technique, but there are quite a few changes. Often in criticism, this is linked to the publication of another Gothic novel, which we'll get to in a minute, The Monk, and the rise of the Horror Gothic. So the idea is in part that Anne Radcliffe was responding to The Monk and the Horror Gothic and rejecting its successes. But we also see that she's adopting some of its techniques. So one of the major differences between The Mysteries of Udolpho and The Italian is simply length. The Italian is shorter, it's more compact, it's tighter. And it gets rid of a lot of the sort of contemplative nature description. It focuses in a lot more on its story, something that arguably is a response in part to Matthew Lewis's incredibly tightly plotted novel. We also have an emphasis on the villain as a key character. So The Italian is about sort of trials and tribulations of Elena and Vivaldi, whose parents, her parents are dead, his parents don't want them to marry. But a key figure, and one who becomes really arguably the main character, is the Italian of the title, the monk Schedoni. He is in league with Marchesa di Vivaldi, Vivaldi's mother, in order to separate the young couple, and it's his machinations which really control the plot. We can see him in the first picture there, scheming with the Marchesa di Vivaldi, but in the second, we see him at the point of murdering Elena when he realizes, or thinks he realizes, that she is his daughter. She's not, she's related to him, but she's not his daughter. But he has this change in perspective and aim halfway through the text. But that isn't where all of his complexity lies at all. He's a complex and multifaceted character who becomes central to the narrative because of the interest of his story. We also have in The Italian the deployment of the Inquisition, which is a key and repeated trope of the early Gothic, particularly the Horror Gothic, and we see Radcliffe using it really for the first time. And I would argue much more effectively than Matthew Lewis. Matthew Lewis goes for the more overt horrors, whereas Radcliffe uses a variety of narratorial techniques to create terror. So she focalizes to the hero, and we are narrowed down to his perspective. So we are kind of lost in the same insecurity. I don't know where we are. We can't see. We can hear, but not understand what's going on. And so with Vivaldi, we're lost in this kind of horrible labyrinthine structure filled with the screams of the tormented. It's very effective. So this is the second novel that gets a shout out in Northanger Abbey. But let's go back to this other form of the Gothic that we're seeing, this other strand, the Horror Gothic. The horror that Radcliffe describes, or what Radcliffe describes as horror, is something that doesn't sort of expand our faculties and make us think and fill us with curiosity, but rather narrows down our understanding. It freezes us. Our response is visceral, often to a visual stimulus where we're just shocked and horrified at what we're seeing. The monk, which, as we've noted, is mentioned in Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, is sort of one of the key horror Gothic texts, and it gives us an insight into the type of narrative that you would find in a horror Gothic. Just as a fun thing here, this is from the early publication. You can see an illustration pointing to Ambrosio there signing his deal with the devil, but also the 18th century didn't believe in spoiler alerts. You've just got the entire story there on the frontispiece. But this, as I've said, is the story of Ambrosio and his sort of fall. We have corrupt monks signing demonic contracts. We also have a number of salacious scenes. We have sex scenes, essentially. A slight kind of fade to black, but they're still there. We have a lot of boobs popping out all over the place, quite literally. We've got ghosts, real ghosts, undead nuns in this case. We've got other manifestations of the supernatural, such as immortal wanderers, borrowing from tropes like the Wandering Jew and Faust in the depiction of an immortal wanderer. We have matricide, soricide as well, incest, rape, rotting babies, horrifyingly, imprisoned nuns, and blasphemy. There's a lot going on. So the tale is principally about the fall of Ambrosio, but there's a secondary plot with two young lovers, Raymond and Agnes, who plan to run away together. She's going to pretend to be the bleeding nun. But unbeknownst to them, the bleeding nun is real. So Raymond ends up running off with a ghost. Agnes ends up being caught, locked in a convent. She pregnant, then they fake her death. She's locked in a cellar. She ends up having her child. The child dies. It's all very, very, very grim and very, very viscerally depicted. So this is the type of horror, this is the type of Gothic that John enjoys. Now, I've given you those two strands, but remember, these aren't universal. These aren't the only forms of horror. And we're about to look at the horrid novels themselves and the ways in which they challenge some of these binary distinctions. But I'll just mention that there are sort of other examples of the Gothic in the period that don't really fit into these binaries at all. So we have things like the sort of Orientalist Gothic fantasies of William Beckford in Vathek, or we have the philosophical Gothic of William Godwin in novels like Caleb Williams, which is an exploration of political justice, or St. Leon, which is a novel about perfectibility. But back to the horrid novels. The horrid novels is the list of novels that Isabella gives to Catherine. And they can teach us a lot about sort of the range of novels in the 1790s. They can also tell us a lot about the publishing practices of the Gothic and give us an insight into sort of what was going on with the publishing of the Gothic, what was popular. So the novels that are mentioned are The Castle of Wolfenbach by Eliza Parsons, Claremont by Regina Maria Roche, The Mysterious Warning, Jane Austen gets a couple of her titles wrong, The Mysterious Warning, again by Eliza Parsons, who appears twice, The Necromancer or Tales of the Black Forest, and we'll get into authorship of that in a second, Midnight Bell by Frances Latham, Orphan of the Rhine by Eleanor Sleeth, and Horrid Mysteries by Carl Gross. And we are assured that they are all horrid. Now, these novels predominantly fit into a Terra Gothic pattern, but they really deconstruct that binary a little bit because they include elements of horror alongside this Terra Gothic. So this is an overview of the text. We can see they're all from the 1790s, which was really the heyday of the Gothic, just from 1793 to 1798. There is something suggestive about this timing. We can talk about sort of the fin de siècle, and that sort of end of a century, but we've also got this overlap between the Gothic and the period of the French Revolution. So the fall of Bastille in 1789, and then you have the terrors of 1793 and 94. And this link was made by critics at the time. The Gothic was sometimes referred to as a literature of not just terror, but a terrorist literature, which was not only a response, but kind of promulgating the terrors and disorder of the French Revolution. We also have somebody like the Marquis de Sade saying that, you know, when you've got this kind of the bloody horrors of the French Revolution, this is the only kind of literature that makes sense anymore. Um, having a little overview, though, we can pick out some salient features of the Gothic of the period. One thing to note is the publishers. So most of the novels that Radcliffe chooses to mention were published by the Minerva Press, which you might be already familiar with. It was a press that was attached to a circulating library. It was started in, I forget this, and I didn't check between classes either, between the 1780s and 90s, and was publishing quite fast a lot of novels, mostly in these particular genres of the Gothic. It's famous for producing Gothic novels. We see with Minerva that there were various almost house writers who published almost exclusively with Minerva, but also we find them publishing single works by other authors. Now, they weren't the only publishers of the Gothic by any stretch of the imagination. We've got an example here. H.D. Symonds was the publisher of The Midnight Bell by Francis Latham, and we have publishers like Robinson publishing Radcliffe, giving massive advances. So Radcliffe was record-breaking with her Mysteries of Udolpho. She got £500, which at the time is roughly equivalent to in today's money to 60,000, but was, as I say, record-breaking. She got an even bigger advance for the Italian. So the Gothic could be big business, but presses like Minerva were not paying anything like that for the manuscripts that we were getting. Later, you have the rise of the chapbook presses, so people like Anne Lemoyne, and they're paying even less and churning out even more Gothic texts. Something else to notice here is the way in which this list makes clear that there was a lot of sort of cross-influence between European writing, the continental European writing, and British Gothic, specifically, as we see here, German writing, but also French writing. So 3 of these books are connected to German stories. Less obviously, The Midnight Bell says that it's based on a German tale. And more obviously, The Necromancer and the Horrid Mysteries are both, to some extent, translations. So translated works were a sort of large part or an important part of the Gothic productions of the 1790s. The Necromancer or the Tale of the Black Forest has quite a complicated provenance, as you'll see there. So it was published under the name Ludwig Flammenberg, but this was in fact a pseudonym for Carl Friedrich Callet. But the novel, as it was published in English, bore relatively little relation to what Callet wrote himself, because it was translated by Peter Chuthold, whose actual name was Peter Will. And in translating it, he changed it quite significantly from a series of sort of separate tales to a cohesive novel, also including work taken, just plagiarized from Schiller's The Ghost Seer and just flung in at the end. What this points us to is some questions about the quality of a lot of these translations, and also the sort of how above board some of these publishing practices were. The Horrid Mysteries similarly is an abridged translation by Peter Will, once again, of a German novel. And as we'll see, this translation was not particularly successful, partially because of that abridgment. The other thing to note about this list is how frequently we're seeing female names for the authors here. Often, I work teaching the 18th and 19th centuries, and often a lot of my students are under the impression that there weren't many women writers, or they certainly weren't successful. And we see outliers like Jane Austen and later the Brontes or George Eliot really being exceptions to the rule. However, this isn't really the case, and particularly in the 1790s and in the Gothic, women were really at the forefront of publishing, and we do see many women publishing. We also see the professionalization of the female author in this period, so women writing to live. And we also see the ways in which, for example, the byline by a lady or a female author's name was a seller for these novels. We've got a few kind of key names here. Eliza Parsons is quite a prolific writer. Regina Maria Roche, very, very popular, as we'll discuss in a second. And Eleanor Sleeth, an interesting case study. And obviously Radcliffe, as we've already mentioned. So a lot of these key writers were women. So that's a little bit of an overview of some of the sort of key factors here, but let's have a think about the novels themselves. And just to finish this lecture, I'm going to go through the different novels, give you some information about them, and think about how they might connect to Northanger Abbey. So the Castle of Wolfenbach, I'm going through them in this order by date. The Castle of Wolfenbach by Eliza Parsons is quite a short Gothic novel, 2 volumes, and it is perhaps the most traditionally fitting, it's the most traditional Terra Gothic. So it's fitting into that mold the most easily and the most kind of conclusively. So it's the story of a virtuous heroine, Matilda, who is fleeing from persecution of some sort. She ends up at the Castle of Wolfenbach, partially ruined, of course, and she's told that it's haunted, and she hears clanking chains at night. But unlike Anne Radcliffe, Eliza Parsons isn't really interested in getting us believing in the supernatural and puzzling over it. Instead, Matilda is like, yeah, no, I think that's probably some kind of mystery. Somebody is rattling some chains, pretending to be a ghost, and lo and behold, that's exactly what's happened. So it's a very sort of boring example of the supernatural explained in some ways. Because the chains are being rattled by Victoria, the Countess of Wolfenbach, who's been imprisoned by her husband because he accused her of adultery, and she's meant to sort of rattle the chains to scare anybody away from the castle. We have the helpful servants. We have Albert, who helped Matilda escape. We often find in Gothic novels that servants are the most useful people. Joseph and Bertha were the servants that were looking after the Countess of Wolfenbach. Joseph knew she was alive and he survives the novel. Bertha didn't know she was alive and she dies in a fire because the Count of Wolfenbach kidnaps his wife again, is wanting to murder her, and just sets fire to the castle and just happens to burn Bertha alive. So that's pretty grim. We have a noble hero, useless, of course, the Count de Bouville, and the persecuting uncle, so the murderous and incestuous uncle, Mr. Weimar, from whom Matilda is running. But it's not really the Count de Bouville who saves her, rather she is saved and helped by a number of women throughout the text. Although women also function as rivals and cautionary tales. So there's Mrs. Courtney, who is a rival for the affections of the Count de Bouville, and after Matilda has fled to England, she spreads various rumours about Matilda, meaning Matilda has to flee to France to go and stay in a convent there. Mademoiselle de Fontanelle is also a rival for the Count de Bouville's affections, or she thinks she is, and so she tells Matilda that that she and the Count are going to get married, which forces Matilda to give up all hope, but she's mistaken. We also have the assorted villains that you would expect in a Gothic narrative, but they're not the usual banditti. They are pirates this time, so a little bit of excitement there. But this is the basic sort of Terra Gothic with which Jane Austen is principally interacting, although her heroine, Catherine, has a lot more imagination than Matilda. The Necromancer, or Idol of the Black Forest, is similarly interested in this motif of the supernatural explained, in presenting us with a mystery, creating emotions which are then resolved naturally. We can think about this novel in relation to this question of translation versus adaptation. As I've mentioned, all the changes that were made by Peter Will. It also points us towards the influence of German tales and also the possibilities of plagiarism within the Gothic. It points us towards, as well, another key feature of the Gothic that we've already seen in texts like the Castle of Otranto, but that of the frame narrative, and in the Italian as well, where we get this kind of introductory narrative. The frame narrative in The Necromancer is two friends talking to each other about their potentially supernatural experiences. And it's also used to present one of these over-exaggerated gaps between the presentation of a supernatural mystery and its resolution. Because in the frame narrative, one of the characters says, well, this is what happened to me. And the other's like, oh, wow, yeah, that sounds supernatural, though. But it's not, though, I think. Anyway, he has in his collection of papers, he has the real story of what happened to his friend, but he doesn't tell him. He just gives him the papers, and then we, along with the friend, discover what actually happened right at the end of the novel. So the frame narrative is used to produce this exaggerated gap. And the effect of this is essentially to make the reader, in some sense, a character in the novel. And what do I mean by that? Well, this is a novel which is very much warning us against superstitious belief in quite a mocking and a harsh way. This isn't the gentle satire of Northanger Abbey. Instead, we're told throughout that everything that Volkert, the seeming necromancer, does is all either deceit or the effects of a deluded fancy. We know that, we're told that the supernatural doesn't exist. We're told that everything has a natural explanation, but these elongated gaps and the way in which we're bombarded with apparently supernatural happenings, works of Volkert, we start to believe. And the book, in some ways, is punishing both its characters and its readers for this desire to believe, for letting ourselves be fooled. You have the Austrian, another of the characters, when Volkert is finally revealed as, a trickster, as a fraud and not a necromancer, he begs him to lie and say that he does have powers. He's, I forgive thee, I'll pronounce thee my benefactor. Everything you've done to me, it doesn't matter. Only speak and tell me I am not deceived. He's so dedicated to belief at this point, and it's suggested that we as readers are as well. We've allowed ourselves to be tricked and bamboozled by the phantasmagoria of the seemingly supernatural. So I think there's quite a lot of overlap here in some ways with Northanger Abbey, where the reader is mocked alongside the character in some ways for their belief, for their tension, their surprise. But the Necromancer is a cruel text, unlike Northanger Abbey. It really is laughing at you. The Horrid Mysteries I've mentioned, if you're going to read the horrid novels and you're like, well, I don't have time for all of them, miss this one out. So the horrid novels, as I've said, is a translation, but it's also an abridgment, and its modern publishers even refer to it as a bizarre work whose labyrinthine plot defies summary. It defies summary because it makes no sense. Peter Will has chopped, changed, and taken so much out that it's really almost incoherent and difficult to follow. So the opening chapter kind of throws us in media res, where we're in a castle and there's a lady and she's woken up, and there's a lot of sort of seemingly fairly nice people around, quite courteous, but they have some dark design. She's sure of it. There's a secret here. And you're like, what is going on? I have no idea where we are or what's happening or who any of these people are. Maybe the second chapter will help. And they're like, nope, it's a different timeline, completely different characters and a different mystery. And you never really understand how that first chapter fits in to the rest of the novel, for example. So it's a difficult read and fairly incoherent, but it does point us towards some interesting features of the early Gothic. So one of the main threads through the novel is this idea of secret societies, and this fear of secret societies was a major part of the German Gothic, much more so than the English Gothic. And it ties into this idea of the French Revolution and its influence on the Gothic and on Gothic writing. Because this idea of secret societies, of shadowy cabals, of political movements who are working to destabilize the state was a fear that circulated particularly strongly as a result of the French Revolution. Again, as with the other two books that we've looked at, magic is revealed here as deceit. So again, we have this warning not to allow ourselves to believe. Something that we don't find in Northanger Abbey at all, though, are the salacious adventures of the main character, who is just off having a wild time a lot of the time. Now, I've said if you don't read one, don't read Horrid Mysteries, but this is, if you do read one and you're only going to read one, this is the one I recommend. It takes a lot of time. It's a 4-volumer, so it is a long read, but it is really quite enjoyable. I don't know if you follow me on Twitter. If you have, I've been tweeting for a couple of months now my reread of The Mysterious Warning. So if you look at Ron Gotham, you can find that. I finished the tweet thread this morning, actually, because I was like, I'm going to finish it before this class. And you can see some of the adventures if you want to see if the novel is something that you might enjoy. Now, it's the story of two brothers, although this is a vast understatement. So it's the two brothers, Rodolphe and Ferdinand. One of them, Rodolphe, is bad, and one of them, Ferdinand, is good. So Ferdinand is being tricked by his brother, Rodolphe. He believes that Rodolphe loves him, but Rodolphe is actually working against him to try and separate him from his father, trying to seduce his wife, and eventually tries to kill him. However, although the main core of the story is these two brothers, what we find is much more convoluted. So if we read Northanger Abbey, or even if we read Mysteries of Udolpho, we're primarily used to a couple of key or central storylines. And that's maybe what we expect from the Gothic. But more realistically, in many of the Gothic novels of the period, what we're finding is not just frame narratives, but like almost endless inset narratives. So Ferdinand at one point leaves his castle and begins his adventures alone, goes through all of these trials and vicissitudes, ends up meeting and helping various people. But everyone he meets gets a backstory. So you're just kind of poddling along with Ferdinand. You're like, okay, the story is moving forward. Nope. 20 years back in the past, another character's backstory. And you get these various kind of backstories, and then they all end up intertwining together, and this sort of complicated mass of characters and stories erupts. One of the other main characters whose story gets told is the story of their sister Fatima, or Charlotte. She goes by Fatima through most of the novel, only reverting to Charlotte when she's wanting to make a claim on the estate. So who knows what her preferred name really is. Who, as we will discover, is one of my favourite characters. She also connects us, though, to one of the key trends of the early Gothic, which is recurring but less often talked about, is the Orientalism that we find in the Gothic. So Fatima has had a really tough life of it. She was the illegitimate half-sister of these two brothers. Her mother ran away with her when she was a child. She was orphaned. Later, her carers stole all her money. They wanted to sell her to the highest bidder. She ends up running away with an army officer. He dies. She's kidnapped as a prisoner of war. She ends up becoming part of a seraglio. But this kind of depiction of her in Turkey is really reflects a lot of the obviously very problematic Orientalist tropes of the period, Orientalist and racist tropes of the period, particularly in the depiction of Turkey and the depiction of Islam. So we have a lot of stereotypes coming through, particularly about Islamic beliefs. So one of the things you keep finding over and over again in the early Gothic is this assertion that Muslims don't believe that women have souls. But nobody's really sure where this is coming from. So she ties us into this Orientalism of the early Gothic, but also she's one of my favorite characters because she is a villain. And she's one of these early examples of female villainy, as we find in, for example, Victoria in the novel Floyer by Charlotte Dacre. She ends up robbing people, stabbing people, murdering people. But I'm mostly on her side. She did what she had to survive her whole life. And then when she returns to Germany with her Turkish husband, Healy, her brother says, when he's finally discovered her, and he says, well, I can help you separate from him. And she's like, okay, I'm listening. And then he says, so you can go and live retired in the countryside away from all human eyes, or you can go live in a convent because, you had sex before marriage. And she's just like, no, no, I don't love that for me. And so she gets herself out of a situation that she doesn't want to be in. She steals jewels, she runs off, and she sort of is successful, really. She defies Ferdinand and all of his very sanctimonious little discourses at her. And she uses his shame of her against him because he's so ashamed that she's his sister. She's like, I'm going to tell people I'm your sister unless you let me get away with this box of jewels. And he does, because he's a wuss. But unfortunately, she is, of course, punished by the text, as we will find repeatedly in these early Gothic texts, that we might have an exploration of female desire, female agency, but we often have it punished by the text. She ends up killing herself and somebody else in a fit of, I'm not going to get taken alive. Villainy is a continuous focus in the Mysterious Warning, and we have quite a lot of interesting first-person villainy narratives. So the picture here refers to this villain Baron S, and we have his own, we find his manuscript where he details his terrible deeds. What we see in the picture is a key scene in his story. So Baron S fell in love with the woman that we see here. Well, fell in love. And they wanted to marry her, but she was already engaged to somebody else, or her heart belonged to somebody else, and she refused. She ends up running away. She tries to refuse, ends up getting married to him, but in her head she said the other guy's name. Runs away, goes to live with the other guy who she marries. But the Baron pursues them and he finds them. And he goes on this killing spree in the castle. He just kills everybody except them, who he locks in a cellar for 12 years. And this is a really good example of how it's, those distinctions between terror and horror are not very helpful at times, because his writing is horror. It's full horror. You get this kind of first person slasher movie as he works through the castle. not what you'd expect from an 18th century novel at all. And then you get this scene in the dungeon where, you can see a small child. The child is unwell. He's brought the water for the day, but when they're sort of begging him for the water, he just throws it on the floor at their feet. And after watching the child die, he says, "Oh, what a luxury of revenge." So he's a very unrepentant villain. Claremont is a novel by the Irish author Regina Maria Roche, and she's quite an interesting author and points us towards what I mentioned at the beginning, that our idea of the Gothic, an idea even its popular authors and its key authors, is often informed not so much by the realities of the period as by our retrospective framing of the Gothic. So the fact that Anne Radcliffe is seen as the key Gothic author is in part true in that she was influential and she was very popular, but there were other authors that were at times as popular as she was and arguably as influential. But Radcliffe gets picked out partly because Walter Scott picked her out. So in his writing, his Lives of the Authors, he picks her out and says, well, Anne Radcliffe is the best, the most respectable. A lot of them are writing drivel, but not her. And that got sort of picked up and then repeated in criticism up until the current day. But Regina Marie Roche is sort of an interesting counterpoint to this, because she was a bestseller in her day and a rival to Radcliffe. So, for example, her Children of the Abbey novel almost outsold Radcliffe and certainly kept selling well into the 19th century. Claremont is her most Gothic novel, and it's a story of family secrets and the sins of the fathers. It revolves around this mysterious figure, Claremont, who is a father with a mysterious past. He's got a lot of gloom going on. We don't know where he comes from or what secrets he's hiding. De Sevigny appears, and he's the love interest of our heroine, but he is a young man with a mysterious sorrow who for some reason can't marry her. Madeline, the young woman who mysteriously, I just had to throw it in there again, keeps getting abducted by people. But why? What's going on here? Well, the why is connected to the D'Alembers, who are the mystery conspiracy, who are the villains of the piece. And it eventually, works out that the secret is that Claremont killed his brother in a fit of jealous rage, but he actually didn't. Towards the end of the novel, Madeline is kidnapped by the D'Alembers, Claremont is kidnapped by the D'Alembers, and we realize that years ago they kidnapped his brother as well, who is their hostage or has been their hostage. Don't worry, guys, everything works out well. The marriages all happen, it's all fine, everybody gets free, everyone gets their comeuppance. So the Midnight Bell, second to last one here, again points us towards the influence of the German Gothic. This is an interesting sort of Terra Gothic trope of the importance of sound. And it also points us towards or away from a misconception. I mentioned when I looked at the Terra Gothic that we often think about a female heroine, but in this novel and in a number of the other novels we've looked at, we often have a split focus on male and female protagonists, or a central male protagonist, as in The Mysterious Warning. This is a story, again, you might be getting familiar with these themes of inheritance, identity, and family secrets. The key kind of motif in this text is regrettable oaths, words that you can't take back, something that Catherine Morland is familiar with. It's a story of a man whose father was murdered, and his mother makes him promise to avenge his father's death and to kill his father's murderer. But then the next night she appears blood on her hands and makes him promise and give an oath to leave the castle and never return. When he does return to the castle, he finds it's haunted, or there's rumors of haunting, although it's not a real haunting, again, supernatural explained, and we find the priests as ghost wielders. So this idea of priests using the supernatural to con people is quite common in the Gothic, but here they're using it for a good purpose. It's to protect his mother. So supposedly her ghost haunts the abbey, but she's really still, haunts the building, but she's really still alive. So what's the mystery here? What happened? Well, his father didn't actually die. He put about that he'd been killed by banditti because he believed his wife was having an affair with his brother and wanted to catch her in the act. So the next day he goes home and she is awoken by somebody entering her room. She thinks it's the brother, and so she stabs him because she's not about to get raped, which I love for her, but she ends up stabbing her husband through the heart. So effectively she's made her son promise to kill her by making him promise to avenge the murder of the father. So the last one here, and I'll whistle stop tour it, because again, it's one with like a bazillion stories all woven again and interconnected. I think you're getting a sense of some of the sameness of some of these Gothics, the repetition of tropes and sort of story elements and themes. But we have a multitude of stories in The Orphan of the Rhine with all of these different characters. And we have a lot of these elements that we've already seen before. So mysterious monks, betrayal, seduction, kidnap, mistaken murder, where you accidentally just stab the wrong woman to death. Murder most foul, where you actually kill the right person, but it's bad that you did. Fake marriage, or is it? That's a key kind of question in a number of texts, including the Mysterious Warning, for example. Did you really marry him? Was he already married to somebody else? Is it bigamy? Bigamy is a big theme that doesn't get talked about a lot in the early Gothic. There are also mysterious orphans, forest assassins, and many more similar tropes. So, one of the things that gets parodied, in part as well by Jane Austen, is perhaps the predictability of the Gothic and these repetition of these same tropes and ideas. But what's sort of interesting about Eleanor Sleath is that her Gothic is pro-Catholic or potentially Catholic Gothic. So often we associate the author of the we associate the Gothic with negative depictions of Catholicism, but in The Orphan of the Rhine, we have positively coded Catholic characters. All the characters are Catholic, and their Catholicism is part of their goodness. There's an interesting sort of counterpoint to a lot of what was going on in the Gothic of the period, and it's an interesting choice for Jane Austen to pick out. So let's bring it all together at the end. We've seen a lot of the influences of the Gothic that are in the novel. We've seen how Jane Austen's list of Gothic novels can teach us about the Gothic of the period and also overcome some of our assumptions, linking us into key patterns, but also kind of working away and wearing down those binaries between the Terra and the Horror Gothic. But what I want to sort of come back to as my central point is that in this novel, Jane Austen is, of course, parodying the Gothic. She's also replicating it. She's also giving it a little bit of a homage. But what the end point is that we're not aligned with Henry Tilney mocking Catherine and her reading of Gothic novels. It's shown to mislead her into over-exaggeration, but also lead to some truths. But what we find, and I'm going to just finish with this paragraph here and looking into it, what we find is actually Henry Tilney gets a bit of a mocking from Jane Austen. And there's a sort of double meaning going on here in Catherine's musings on the Gothic. So she views Mrs. Radcliffe's works were charming were also her imitators, but it was not in them perhaps that human nature, at least in the Midland counties of England, was to be looked for. Of the Alps and Pyrenees, with their pine forests and their vices, they might give a faithful delineation. Italy, Switzerland, and the south of France might be as fruitful in horrors as they were represented. Catherine dared not doubt beyond her own country, and even of that, if hard-pressed, would have yielded the northern and western extremities. So I said we'd come back to this idea that there are bits of Britain which are lost to the wilderness. But in the central part of England, there was surely some security for the existence even of a wife not beloved in the laws of the land and the manners of the age. Murder was not tolerated, servants were not slaves, and neither poison nor sleeping potions to be procured like rhubarb from every druggist. Among the Alps and Pyrenees, perhaps, there was no mixed characters, but in England, in their hearts and habits, there was a general, though unequal, mixture of good and bad. Now, why do I say that this is slightly mocking Tilney or pushing back against that reading? Well, because there's two layers to this. In this moment where Catherine is saying, well, Gothic things couldn't happen in the middle of England, she's actually pointing us towards all the Gothic things that do happen. So she's pointing towards the precarious position of women in law, because there is some security for the existence of a wife, but also not much. One of the sort of key problems of the period was how wives coverture, so that wives effectively cease to legally exist after their marriage because they are covered by their husband. And you get sort of things that are, for example, explored by Mary Wollstonecraft, where the putting women in insane asylums to get rid of them, the control that husbands had over their wives' agency after marriage. And as we know from all of Jane Austen's novels, she is more than aware of the precarity of the position of women in the period. This idea that murder was not tolerated, but we know that murder happened frequently, that servants were not slaves. Well, that points us towards one of the darkest realities of that period of British history. When Austen wrote this novel originally in the 1790s, not only enslavement, but the trade in trafficked Africans itself was still legal. So this comment itself points us towards the fact that there were, in fact, enslaved people, and in Britain at the time. Sleeping potions are to be procured. Poison is readily available in some types of poison are relatively readily available. So all of these denials about the Gothic nature of the world just point us back towards them. And Henry Tilney's earlier smug idea that these things don't happen in Britain, it's the modern age. Well, none of his arguments are very convincing. And the things that happen, the terrible things that can happen, might not look the same as Gothic novels. But there's still a darkness underlying the civility, the sort of civil veneer of reality. The other thing that she learns is about mixed characters, as we've also noticed. She realizes that people can be good and bad. She learns to interpret people better. But as we find by the end of the novel, she hasn't given up on the idea of villains. We see her re-understand General Tilney, realizing that she hadn't sinned against him by thinking of him as a villain. She realizes that villains exist, but now she realizes that even villains are a mixture of good and bad, and you have to be a lot more subtle to find them. So I hope that people have enjoyed this talk. Thank you for listening, and thank you for that, ignoring the interruption in the middle. I hope you've enjoyed, and now is the time for any questions.